everyone. Welcome to Life-Changing Books, where we are discussing the incredible life-changing books of Access Consciousness. I am here with Shannon O'Hara, the author of Talk to the Entities and Beings of Light, which are two incredible books that for me have personally given me a lot of ease in making sense of stuff that I guess in this world we are not taught to make sense of. So thank you so much, Shannon, for being here today.
Thank you for having me. Hello, everybody out there, past, present, and future.
Yes. So let's talk a little bit about Talk to the Entities, because Talk to the Entities is one of the specialty classes that Shannon has created that use the Access Consciousness tools. And she wrote this amazing book on the topic, which I think has changed so many people's lives. And one of the things that I wanted to speak with you is, what was it that inspired you to write this book?
Well, if we're talking, so the Talk to the Entities book came first, and I would say probably what inspired me was, entities. I would say I co-authored that book. I co-authored both of the books, really. And I wrote it at a time in my life where I was a young adult and I was looking at really creating my life. And I think probably my dad recommended like write a book, but really this book just kept coming and coming and it wouldn't leave me alone. It took me many years to write that first Talk to the Entities book. Number one, because I'm really dyslexic, so that was not a skill set I naturally had at my fingertips. And number two, I was young, and number three, I'd never written a book before. And number four, I was like, this is such weird content. This is such a strange topic. I really had to work through a lot of self-doubt and judgment and not wanting to be seen as crazy. Then it took some years, but that book really was created through inspiration. And every time I would finally make some progress with that book, I knew I was going in the right direction. Everything got easier, which is a great reward of that creation.
Yeah, and I think it also is really the vibe of the book. It really makes everything easier when it comes to the spirit world, which I think, for me personally, a lot of the stuff that I've read before about, ghost spirits, entities, mediums, channeling, all of that stuff was super interesting, and it didn't necessarily create ease in my world. It just seemed a bit complicated and like this other kind of realm that I still couldn't quite access. But there's something, in the way that this book is written that to me is so brilliant, because it does really demystify a lot of what we think we cannot understand. And you talk a lot about that in the book, about, having more ease with this, about how to access what you know.
Yeah. Well, it's a story written of my own. So it's a story of my life essentially, and my life to date, to when that book was completed. And it's not a story of like, this is the way it should be. It's just a story of a girl being aware of ghosts, and how I went from having it as this real just prevalent experience as a child to being a teenager driven crazy by it, to being a young adult that really struggled, to being a very empowered young adult who had the great fortune of also being educated and empowered by a man who was extremely different and also capable of giving me the tools and the processes to make being aware of and living in a world full of spirits like not a terrifying thing, but actually a productive thing. So I feel that I have a great fortune and great courage and discovering those processes. And I can't tell you the amount of people I've had reach out to me after reading the book and being like, wow, I had so many aha moments reading that book. It's like, all my life I thought I was crazy, but reading about your experience with the X, Y, and Z, I realized I've actually was just dealing with ghosts and I didn't realize it.
Yeah, 100%. I add myself to being one of those people too. And one of the stories that for me was so interesting to read was kind of, it's at the beginning of the book. It's a story where your friend Tanya has a twin sister, I think, who passed away. And Shannon talks about how she's sitting there with her friend who is incredibly sad. She's just lost her twin sister, but you are actually seeing the twin sister. right there, and how that interaction goes, and talking to Tanya and saying, hey, I think your sister might be here, and which is, possibly not the easiest thing to say to somebody. And what I love though is that in the book it then goes on to say how after a while Tanya, said to you, listen, at the time I had so many feelings and emotions going on that they were actually getting in the way of me perceiving and picking up the fact that my sister was there, until I started to see the signs everywhere. And I thought that was so brilliant, because it really shows us how when we do kind of get involved in the fear or the unease, we can really kind of stifle our perception of this world. Would you talk a little bit to that, and how that's been for you?
Well, it's an interesting time in human history to be talking about ghosts because, whatever culture you're from on Earth right now, it's widely varying in the acceptability of spirits as like a realistic conversation.
Yeah.
If you're from, the North American continent like I am, it's something that spirits just don't exist. Like it's a no-go zone. If you're from India or Africa or Asia, it's a completely different. They totally believe in spirits. They worship ancestors. They have a very dynamic hierarchy of spirits, but it's also laced with huge amounts of significance and miseducation and disempowerment. And so it's an interesting time in human history to be talking about spirits because 1,000 years ago, every person living on Earth believed in spirits.
Mm.
And I mean, of course, this is not something I can offer up as fact. However, if you look at even in Shakespeare's time, he had characters in his plays and in his stories that were ghosts. So it was a much more acceptable, known thing. Fast forward till today, the only prevalent education that we get about the spirit world is unfortunately from movies and television, which are not usually an empowering medium. Like the horror industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry, so the scare factor is huge, and that puts a lot of people off from dealing with ghosts.
Yeah.
And as silly and like surfacey as that sounds, it's true. When you watch a scary movie when you're a kid, that sets you off on a trajectory and a path for entity resistance that you might not even be aware of at the time. But then when you're 45 years old and you're awakened by some spirit like pulling on your foot in bed, instead of having the wherewithal to deal with what's showing up, you put up these huge barriers, go into massive reaction, and a reaction that then completely controls you not in a fun way. Whereas if you're given the information, the empowerment, and the education to not go into immediate fear and reaction, you could potentially open up to the spirit who's waking you up by pulling on your foot and recognize that it might be your deceased father or another loved one who is there to actually like expand possibility with you and contribute, not terrify you.
Yeah.
And I just see that it's such a crippling thing that occurs for so many people when they lose people, quote unquote, and it it really diminishes the possibility of life when you exclude the other life that we have when our bodies change.
It's so true. And I love hearing you talk about this, because the way you speak about it is really so pragmatic. It's really like, how do you have this as a gift? And even as you go through the book, which you guys will hopefully read at some point, you will notice that what in every one of the stories, it culminates in there being a gift, so either somebody getting closure that they needed, or somebody being able to move on in a way that they required, or somebody receiving information that they had been asking for, which I think is the side of this that sometimes can get a little bit confusing for people wondering what that gift is.
Yeah, I mean, people get totally stuck with the death process. People on this side who still have their bodies, and then people crossing over who lose their bodies, and all of a sudden everyone's ignoring them and pretending like they don't exist anymore. It's not in my opinion, it's not a particularly healthy way of dealing with that whole process, but it is
Yeah.
something that we've inherited through centuries of religion and miseducation. So it's really the time now to wake up to the new possibility of that being aware of ghosts and being a ghost isn't wrong. It actually might be a strongness. Now, how do we learn how to be with this?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so one of the things that I wanted to ask you as well is, through you've spoken a little bit about miseducation, and to me, the book talked to the entities and also the classes and all the material that is available on that is really about re-educating you to have access to this whole other world, again with a level of ease and enjoyment with it, actually something that can really enrich your life. Now, in the book, Shannon speaks about how she met her stepdad, her dad, but at the time, and how he came across the Access Consciousness tools and really kind of showed you that you had a gift that you at the time weren't quite sure what to do with, or even how to interpret that as a gift, when it just was this whole world that you were aware of that was so different than other people, had access to. How has it been for you, using the Access Consciousness tools and making that, I guess, very conscious choice and decision every day to use those tools to expand your awareness in this area?
Well, one of the primary essential cornerstones of Talk to the Entities is clearing entities, and that
Mm.
was a tool and process. That is one of the tools in the Access Consciousness toolbox, and one that Gary taught me at a very young age. As like I would say, it's a first aid tool for sure.
Mm.
Because when you if you there is nothing quite like that can create as much relief as clearing entities when you're aware of entities, So if you know how to effectively clear entities, it's a real lifesaver. So that tool was massive for me. And is massive for a lot of people. It's massive for a lot of entities too, who just simply are lost and really require somebody with these tools to work with them for change. One of the other really big tools that I would say made this into a gift and a power rather than a disability is the point of view, or the stance of like interesting point of view.
Mm.
So rather than being super significant, which the topic of entities is so weighed down by, in I really had to hold steadfast to this choice of, okay, whatever I'm perceiving, whatever's showing up, whatever I think about myself because I'm perceiving this, et cetera,
Mm.
is just an interesting point of view. It's not a judgeable offense. It's not something that I require to have a point of view about. I am open. This is interesting. This doesn't mean anything.
Mm.
And that in and of itself gave me the space to discover what was possible without freaking myself out.
Yeah, that is so wonderful and such an easy way to really like have a sense, I guess, of control with yourself
Yeah.
when everything else is, can seem so like wild and crazy at times.
Especially when you're dealing with that spirit world, because it's not like we're dealing with like a known quantity. Like I think if you talk about books on relationship and books on money, yes,
Mm.
a lot of the access consciousness books are using the same. You'll see interesting point of view showing up in a lot of these books.
Yeah.
And it's a real lifesaver when you're dealing with something that could potentially make you feel crazy, like talking to
Yeah.
entities, which it can do. Been there, done that. So having these really, like, I would almost call it, don't tell Gary I said this, but grounding, like interesting point of
Yeah.
view grounds me into the space where I don't have to be in reaction to my awareness. I can have a lot more ease.
Yes. And, I think that leads in quite nicely to the other book that we wanted to talk about, which was The Beings of Light, which, is now a completely not different spin, but a whole different way of accessing this world that is available that actually desires to contribute to you. And one of the lines that I just love in that book that stands out every time, I've read it probably like 3 or 4 times. It says, "You are cared for," which I think is so really just beautiful and not necessarily something that you would expect when you read a book about the spirit world, but just the energy of that is so wonderful. So what, again, like what was the inspiration behind this book? Because this one is very specific and it does walk you through specific exercises.
One of the things that I never expected when I started out with entities, for me, I had to deal with it because otherwise it would have killed me. I'm
Mm,
that aware of ghosts. So for me, when I first started in my early, when I first finally reluctantly surrendered and said, yes, I'll do this, um, it was about surviving and it was about getting out of the pain. But something that started showing up after I uh, chose to say yes and not go into reaction around entities was that there were these like mega beings that were showing up that I had no reference point for, no familiarity with. I was not something I'd ever known or seen or gotten before. But there were these beings showing up that I had no idea what they were doing there or what to do with. I could perceive their presence, but it was like this really non-directional experience. And initially, like, there's basically four pillars in the Talk to the Entities curriculum, which is the first one's clearing, what we talked about. That's like the entry level how to deal with entities. Like, first,
mm,
we're going to teach you how to clear. And then there's the second step is communication, um, which you have to sort of reteach yourself how to communicate with spirits, which can be hugely empowering in and of itself, and give you access to capacities, space, and energies that you might have cut off a long time ago, um, for whatever reason.
mm,
So we have clearing, communicating. Then what I found was the receiving, which I was not expecting. I had no preparation for, but there were these mega beings that were there who were working with me and did desire to contribute. I maybe call them like beings of consciousness. I mean, I think we hear them a lot throughout human historical record as angels. Um, but I think that's a very loose term, and there are many beings who could fall into the angel category and not all good. I mean, I think Lucifer was an angel. So it's for me, and since I wasn't raised with religion, and I'm gonna admit I came from California, so I was from a very open culture, a not very open, non-traditional culture. I had to discover these mega beings on my own, and
mm.
it took me a while, but what I started discovering was that my whole universe, like I was being impacted by this incredible presence, but like in this very profound, easy, gratitude enriching way. And I basically discovered these beings that would fall into the entity category that I called beings of light. That's just,
Yeah.
my terminology for them, but they don't have to be called that. That taught me essentially about receiving. And that's what that book, The Beings of Light, is um, their lessons.
Yeah. And, throughout the book, it is, the topic of receiving comes up over and over and over again, which I think is such a, an interesting invitation to something that we're not taught to consciously do at all in life. Even if you go and, perhaps have a coffee with a friend and the friend pays for a coffee, if that makes you kind of like uncomfortable or you feel like you have to say, I'll get it the next time, how much of that is a lack of receiving? What if we could actually receive more? And so just from even that smallest thing. And so I love that this actually teaches you to receive in such a wide way. And one of the things that you talk about in there quite a lot, Shannon, is relaxation. Will you just speak a little bit to that and how that can be linked to receiving?
Whether people realize it or not, and maybe you do, those of you listening to this, watching this in the future might know this, we live in a world full of control, but it's just people that are really controlling. Nature doesn't control in the same way, animals don't control in the same way, the universe governs itself in a really different way. But people do a lot of artificial, I would call artificial control. that has a high cost and a big tax. And that
Mm.
tax is we lose access to the natural energies of the universe. It's like you never would question the power of the ocean. And you would know that it was the one who was in control. The ocean is definitely the boss.
Yeah.
But we as people tend to create a lot of contexts and beliefs where that unfortunately we lose access to energy. And saying losing access to energy, I think it's easy to either not hear that or to misinterpret it. But essentially, everything in the universe is gifting and receiving simultaneously energetically. And many of our lives suffer from this lack or loss of receiving. It trickles down. It starts with your own like sense of personal bliss or awareness, and it trickles down into a lack or loss of happiness,
Mm.
money, joy with the body. And the biggest gift that entities has been for me is that they've actually reignited my capacities to receive, because I couldn't deal with the spirit world and have a barrier up at the same time. I
Mm.
had to relax into what was showing up because I couldn't control it. I think I would love to be able to tell people like talk to the entities, they'll make you feel totally safe and in control, but it doesn't really do that. It gives you this other safety, which is the safety of awareness, the insurance of consciousness that is frankly, I believe, a lost capacity.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And also, talking about that safety of awareness and safety of consciousness, um, to me, that's been a huge gift with all of these books, because in that, you never have to look outside of you for a source. This allows you to become the source of your own awareness, of your own choices, of your own inspiration, and so many things. And you also speak in the book a little bit about the journey of never giving up, which to me is so key, because I think we're in many ways taught that when something comes up that is perhaps starts to get challenging or starts to get uncomfortable, then it means that you're wrong for even going down that route. It means that that's a big stop sign that you shouldn't pursue any longer, rather than allowing yourself to
Oh, yeah.
relax into the receiving of the awareness of, oh, this is maybe something I can address or change. And, I think so much of what the conversations that exist around the spirit world are met with is this energy of, okay, now it's getting uncomfortable, now it's getting a bit intense, let's give up, let's move away. Whereas you really do speak to not giving up, um, and turning that kind of antiquated fear of entities in the spirit world into an ability through actually the choice to not give up. If there was like a question or a tool or something that you could give people who are watching this now and in the future to contribute when they come up with that kind of barrier that they would usually turn away from, what would you say?
Well, with entity stuff, it has to be a matter of making it okay that you're having that
Mm.
perception. Right now, I'm in London, which if you want to deal with a lot of entities, like definitely come to London. And granted, I would say London is infinitely lighter and clearer in a million ways, pollution wise and spirit wise, than it used to be. And if I if I don't acknowledge that I'm aware of a lot of entities here, I sort of create a more difficult, I do create a more difficult experience for myself. But as soon as I acknowledge like, oh, okay, I'm aware of entities, because for example, like since I've been in London, I've been very exhausted. And it's like a weird kind of exhaustion where I'm like, did I work out too hard? Am I tired from overworking? Like I've really been in the question,
Mhm.
but this morning I finally was like, okay, what is this? And wow, this sea of entities. And for most people that's too overwhelming, or it's easier to avoid it or shut it out than to deal with it. But you have to go back to some point in your life, and this might have been when you were a little kid, this might have been when you, whatever age you were, there was probably some point where you were having some sort of entity experience, whether it was with an imaginary friend, and I'm using air quotes if you're only listening to this, because I don't mean imaginary, but I mean a friend that your parents couldn't see, that you had to, they taught you was, oh, you're just imagining it, right? Or it could have been so any kind of entity showing up. And there's usually a Genesis choice that most of us make that sets us on a path of having ease with entities or not. And if it was at one point when you decided, I never want to be aware of that, or my mom doesn't believe this, and therefore I need to shut this out of my universe, or whatever reaction we make initially that essentially doesn't allow us to develop the capacities to include entities. Every time that you say yes to your awareness, even if you don't know how to handle it initially, awareness becomes stronger. Every time you disavow or reject awareness, like I must be crazy, I'm not really perceiving a ghost, or it must be me who's weird when I hear voices, like I must be crazy when I hear voices. What if that's not true? What if you are aware of entities, and what if those voices that you're hearing are entities talking to you, and it's other people that have a problem with it? So the very basic tool is to give yourself permission to know what you know. Because if it isn't you, who is going to give you that permission?
I love that, giving yourself permission. So, wow. So many things. Thank you so much, Shannon, for going over these two incredible books. Please, you guys, check them out. Check out the Talk to the Entities website as well. There's so much material available out there. You'll have all the links below so that you can find these goodies and have them sent out to you wherever you are in the world, whether you buy hard copies or you get something else that is a digital download. Thank you again, Shannon, for having such a different conversation about entities and the spirit world, which I think is a huge gift, and a huge gift in demystifying and clarifying something that can really be so easy and such a contribution to people.
Thank you, Diva. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And we all hope that you find more of you through all of these books. And how's it get better than this?